Hi everyone, it's Stephanie at the Sea Salt Co. and today I have a very fun tutorial for you. We will be making this very scary polymer clay clown, so stick around. These are the three colors that we'll be using today. We will be mixing a little bit of brown with our white to create this ivory cream colored base that I used for the clown. I think it gives it a little bit of a distressed look so that it's not so bright white. And then we will be using a little bit of red, and that is for the balloon. So this is the color that I ended up with. It's kind of like a creamy color. I just didn't want a very bright white effect for the clown. I wanted a little bit of a distressed look. I do dip my cutters into cornstarch, and I rub a little bit of cornstarch onto my slab, and that's just so that I can get the cleanest imprint without the cutter sticking or the clay sticking to the cutter. And I typically try and do this for every cut that I make if it's a very detailed cutter. If it's a simple cutter, then I may not dip as much. So once we've cut all of our shapes out, I like to use a very soft brush and just sweep away the cornstarch and then peel away the excess clay. Here I am scratching the surface of my chalk pastels, and chalk pastels are actually what I use to color this clown. It's one of my favorite methods for adding color to polymer clay because it gives a very realistic effect for food and for textures. So what you see here is I'm just scratching the chalk pastel in order to create a little bit of loose powder that I will dip my brush into and then color my clown with. So we're going to start with a lighter orange for the base coat of the clown's hair. And what I like to do when I am coloring something like this is I like to start with my base coats. And typically my base coats will be lighter, and then I will take my darker colors and kind of do the shading or the details. So now I'm just showing you that I did the same for the rest of the clowns. I do suggest that if you're going to make this clown, now I'm using the gray color, and I will do the same. I will put a base coat on all of the clowns. But what I was trying to say is, if you're going to make a clown like this or any type of earring or polymer clay sculpture or charm that is pretty detailed, I would suggest doing quite a few at a time, because the lengthy part of making something like this is the process and the different steps you have to do. So whether you're making 1 or 10, you won't really be adding very much more time in order to make more. So for example, these earrings that I'm making here in this video took me just a little bit longer than it would take to make 1 pair, and that's because you have to follow all of the steps. So I like to actually shade and color and leave my clay on the tile that I plan on baking it on, because that way you can move it around and kind of look at all the corners and edges to be able to shade them in. Now what you see what I'm doing is I'm going in with the needle tool, and I'm adding a little bit of detail to the top of his ruffle, and I'm only pressing my needle tool into the waistline of him. So the bottom part of that ruffle I'm not going to touch by his legs. We're only going to put a few different imprints on the top. This is actually really simple to do, and once you've done that, you'll notice that it's already starting to look kind of like fabric. So I'll go ahead and add some texture to the hair. You may notice some white spots or spots of clay that don't have color to them, but that's okay because you can always just add more. And you may hear my daughter. She's sitting here next to me as I'm doing this voiceover. So with this, when I'm texturing hair, you're literally just poking it, moving it, and into several different directions, and the more poking you do, the better. Otherwise it may just look like a bunch of tiny little holes. But once you really start to distress and move that clay around, it starts to take on a texture. So here I'm going in with a little bit of a darker color, than the base coat that I started with. And I'm just going to kind of dab around and intentionally leave some spots of light that are showing through. So when I'm adding the shade for his hair, I want to focus on the top little like Hershey Kiss tip that he has on the top of his head, and then the two pieces by his ears. So those pieces will always get more color, whether it's my base color, my shading color, or now the darkest color I'm using in his hair will be this brown. And if you notice, I'm focusing on those three areas. So now we're going to do the same thing to his body, which is we'll add a little bit of depth with some color. And for that, I'm using black, and I'm literally just tracing along the imprints that he already has in his body from the cutter. With this brush, the one that I'm using for this is kind of more of a flat, stiff brush, and that's so I can poke it into the lines. His boots are black, so we'll shade all of those in, but the rest of him, we will just focus on kind of filling in those lines of his imprints. So I'm kind of wondering if I should have cropped these pieces out. I did speed it up a little bit because once you see me do one, you kind of get the idea of what to do for the rest of them, but I figured I would show you me making all of them. That way you could see it's pretty much the same process over and over. Right now we are just filling in a lot of the shading in the lines, which at one point you're actually going to notice that they're going to appear very dark, like I almost over shaded them, but don't worry, that's actually not, it won't end up looking that way. So now I'm going into his top little ruffle, and also if you get any of the chalk pastels on his face or hand or even around his little collar, that's nothing really to worry about, because once he's done baking you can always just go in with acetone and clean those pieces up. Now I'm just doing a couple little ruffles in his sleeve, just like we did with his ruffle around his waist. We're only going to put a few little line imprints at the top of the sleeve. Now I'm taking a fluffy brush and I'm kind of blending out the shading that we put into the imprints that he has. So for his little buttons and his little balls that he has on his shoes, we're going to take little tiny balls of red clay, and we'll be attaching those. So what I did is I rolled out a very thin snake, and then I kind of cut out similar sized pieces so that my little tassel buttons would all be about the same size, or the little pom-poms that clowns have. And you do want to make them really tiny. In this video, when I actually made the pom-poms for his shoe, I made them a little too big, but I just decided to roll with it. It's very easy to make them too big. These little pom-poms that he has on his outfit and shoes are actually very tiny. So now I'm taking a needle tool, and I like to go ahead and make the hole where I plan on putting the little pom-pom, and then I fill it with a tiny bit of clay adhesive. Now you don't have to use the Bake and Bond or clay adhesive, you can just use the clay to clay, but because it's such a tiny detail, I do add that adhesive on there just to give me a little peace of mind that it won't budge. And the needle tool for adding that adhesive works really well. So now I'm taking a dotting tool to pick up these little round balls and place them into that adhesive that we just placed onto his outfit. And here I did put my little pom-poms a little too close to each other, so I'm kind of sliding them away. You want some of the negative space from the back to show up so that it can actually come through as two separate little red pom-poms on his outfit. So from here I will go ahead and add them to the rest of the little clowns, and once those are on, you can either leave them as they are, or you can add a little bit of texture. And the way that I like to add texture to these is using the needle tool. So you'll see me here in a little bit add the texture with the needle tool, which is literally just poking and kind of distressing and moving that clay around to give it a little bit of a porous texture. So now I'm rolling out the little bit of the bigger pom-poms that will be used on his shoe. This is where I said that the little balls are too big. But I kind of just realized it and then continue to keep going instead of starting over. So now I'm doing the same thing I did for the pom-poms on the outfit. I'm just poking a little hole where I want to add them. And I like doing stuff like this as a place mark because I feel like once I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is adding those little circles or little red balls, then it just goes much faster. You're literally just placing them on. So now I'm doing the same thing with adding the clay adhesive, and I will do that to all of the shoes. And once I'm done doing that, you'll see that's when I start adding the clay balls. This was such a fun little clown to make. I actually pulled up a few pictures and kind of went off of those and just tried to make it as close as I could. I did like leaving the face off. I just like the style that it gave the clown. So see, for me those those look disproportionate. The little pom-poms on his shoes are a little too big, but usually other people don't notice things that we do as much as we do. So I don't think anybody's actually going to notice. And this is where I'm adding the texture to his shoes. I'm using that dotting tool to just go ahead and poke some little holes and texture into the little pom-poms that go on his shoes. And I actually think that the more texture you put on the little pom-poms, the more realistic they look. So if you feel like it kind of looks too much like holes punched into clay, then just keep going and it'll actually look better. And I'm just about done giving those little palms texture. So now what we'll do is we'll take a tiny bit of the clay that we used for our base coat of our clown, and I just cut a bunch of little flat strips, and what I'm doing is texturing the bottom portion of that little strip. So the top part of that strip I left alone because I do want it thicker, and then I'll go ahead and push that into his neckline. But we want the top of that piece of clay to be thicker so that it gives the illusion of a very full neck ruffle that starts out thicker and then ends up a little thinner the farther it goes out. So if you notice that your collar is a little too flat or you want to give it a little more volume, you can always just continue to add little pieces of clay like this. They don't look like much once you're texturing them, but once you pick them up and put them onto the clown's collar, you'll really see them come together and start to look like a fluffy fabric collar. So now I'm just kind of poking things around and moving them to give them a little bit of texture. Here I am going on to the rest of the clowns, which I'm doing the exact same thing. Tiny little pieces of clay that I textured at the bottom, and then I will tuck into his neckline. So I'll just keep continuing that process until I'm done with the rest of these clowns. This is probably the most time-consuming part of this tutorial because I did go a little slower to be able to show you all of the steps, but as you could see, the steps were really easy. We start shading with colors, the light orange and the gray, and we're just shading everything and then going in with a little bit of a darker color. But once it comes to actually forming clay, like the little circle balls that we had to roll out, or these little chunks of clay that we're distressing so that they look like fabric ruffles, these parts take longer than the rest of it. Giving the color and those other steps are actually pretty quick. And I'm almost done with the process of putting on the ruffles to his collar. Just finishing up that last little guy. And then from that step, we will go on to lightening up some of his little outfit. So for that, I'll be taking some alcohol and a Q-tip, and then I'll just dab that on the pieces that I want a little bit of less shading on, just to give it more depth perception. And we're going to lighten up directly in the middle of the arm, directly in the middle of the legs, and then in the center of his ruffle that's near his abdomen. So we won't really be lightening it up near the edges. This is Kato translucent liquid clay. I am glazing and putting a coat on, and then I'll be baking my pieces. So for the balloon, we'll only be using black to shade the balloon, and it's a very simple shading. As you can see, we are kind of making this weird C shape. Since I wanted to make mirrored left and right sided earrings, then half of the balloons that I'm making, I'm putting the C shape on the left, and then the other half I'm putting the C shape on the right. So now that I've baked my pieces, I'm showing you that I'll be cleaning up his little hands and face with some acetone. So this is where if you accidentally got any of that chalk pastel on his face or hand, then you can go ahead and just remove it with some acetone. If you don't want to bake with translucent liquid clay, you can always just use a top coat to seal the color once it's done baking. I prefer to use the translucent clay because when I'm sanding like this, I don't have to worry about rubbing any of that color off. And it also, sorry, that's my daughter. It also gives the clay more of a ceramic look because the chalk pastel is under that thin layer of translucent clay. So my little guy actually looks like he could be made out of solid clay and not chalk pastel. So now for the final step. On my balloon, I like to use UV resin. The resin that I'm using is Resin Rockers. I love their resin. This is a great doming resin because it's a little thicker, so you can get that really nice rounded shape without it running off or being too runny or thin. You don't have to use UV resin if you're not comfortable with it. You can always just use a shiny top coat in order to protect that chalk pastel from rubbing off. You do want to make sure not to touch UV resin because it can be toxic to your skin, and the more exposure to it, you can become allergic to the ingredients in the product. Once I've smoothed out all of that resin, you may end up with some bubbles. I really didn't have bubbles, but I did want to show you what to do in case you have them, which is just take a lighter and go over your resin quickly and it'll pop any of those bubbles. Pop it into your UV light, and that will be the final product. This is our little clown and the balloons. Thanks for watching, you guys, and I'll see you on the next tutorial.